James Carter, 62, sat alone near Gate 13 at Salt River Airport, his pen gliding across a leather-bound notebook. The retired Air Force colonel, now a senior consultant for the Department of Homeland Security, had a presence that blended into the crowd: white dress shirt, no tie, a small backpack at his feet. His dark skin, lined with the weight of Birmingham's segregated streets and decades of military service, carried a quiet dignity. Growing up in the 1960s, James had dodged bricks thrown by angry mobs and navigated whites-only signs, learning early that composure was survival. Now, in the cool glow of the airport's LED lights, he jotted notes for a security briefing, his focus unbroken by the hum of travelers or the distant chime of a boarding announcement. The air conditioning brushed his shoulders, and the departure board flickered above, casting blue streaks across the glass walls. James didn't notice the two security officers approaching from the north corridor. Officer Michael Reynolds, 45, led the way, his patchy stubble catching the light. Raised in a small Ohio town where everyone looked like him, Michael had joined airport security after a brief military stint, believing his instinct for spotting trouble was a gift. His partner, a younger officer clutching a coffee cup, trailed behind, glancing at his watch. They slowed near James, Michael's eyes lingering a beat too long, not on the notebook, not on the backpack, but on James's face. "Something wrong?" the younger officer muttered, sensing Michael's pause. "Looks like someone," Michael replied, his voice low, hand brushing the radio on his shoulder. "Might be on the watch list." The younger officer frowned. "He's just writing. Seems normal." Michael didn't answer. His gaze hardened, as if James's stillness was a puzzle he needed to solve. In his mind, honed by years of unchallenged stops, a black man sitting alone, too calm, too focused, was reason enough to act. It wasn't about evidence, it was about a reflex he'd never questioned, one the system had let slide for years. James felt the shift in the air, the weight of being watched not for what he did but for who he was. His pen paused mid-sentence, a familiar ache settling in his chest, not fear, but the exhaustion of being seen through a lens he'd faced since childhood. He closed the notebook, adjusted his backpack strap, and looked up as Michael's boots stopped in front of him. "Identification," Michael said, his tone flat but heavy, a command expecting instant compliance. James's eyes moved from Michael's nameplate to his face, steady and unyielding. He'd been here before: checkpoints, stares, demands for proof of his right to exist. In the Air Force, he'd outranked men who questioned his place. Now, in civilian life, the same script played out. He leaned back slightly, voice low but firm. "Are you screening passengers, or screening skin color?" The question hung there, not loud, not angry, but sharp enough to cut through the airport's hum. Michael froze, his confidence stuttering. James's words weren't defiance, they were a mirror, reflecting a truth Michael wasn't ready to face. The younger officer shifted, glancing at the growing eyes of passers-by, a woman with a child, a man in a hoodie, phone starting to rise. James sat still, his silence louder than any protest, carrying the weight of a lifetime spent proving he belonged. The air at Gate 13 thickened, the soft hum of the airport fading under the weight of James Carter's question. Michael Reynolds stood rigid, his hand hovering near his radio, caught off guard by the calm clarity in James's voice. He'd expected compliance or argument, something he could counter with protocol. Instead, James's words, "Are you screening passengers, or screening skin color?" echoed like a quiet accusation, exposing the unspoken bias Michael had leaned into for years. His face tightened, not with anger but with the unease of being seen. "I'm requesting your identification," Michael repeated, his voice sharper now, clinging to the script of authority. "This is a security procedure." "What procedure?" James asked, his tone steady, eyes locked on Michael's. "What procedure lets you skip everyone else to question someone sitting quietly?" Nearby, passengers slowed their steps. A catering worker paused his cart, eyes darting toward the scene. A young man in a gray hoodie, seated 2 rows back, lifted his phone, the faint click of a recording starting. Michael felt the shift, the weight of eyes settling on him. His instinct, honed in a small Ohio town where difference was suspect, had never been challenged like this. In his mind, James's stillness wasn't innocence, it was a cover, a reason to press harder. But the growing murmurs told him this wasn't just another stop. Sarah Thompson, 38, stood up from her seat, her dark blue coat swaying as she stepped forward. A marketing executive from Seattle, Sarah had grown up in a world that preached fairness but rarely demanded she act on it. Traveling with her son, Ethan, 10, she'd been watching James, noticing his quiet focus before the officers approached. Ethan's questions about right and wrong had been tugging at her lately, and now, seeing James singled out, her stomach churned with a mix of guilt and resolve. She couldn't stay silent, not in front of her son. "I'm on the same flight," Sarah said, her voice clear, cutting through the tension. "I was sitting here before you arrived. Why didn't you ask me first?" Michael's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Step aside, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." But Sarah didn't move. Her heart raced, not from bravery but from the fear of staying quiet, of teaching Ethan that silence was okay. "If it's a security procedure, why him and not me?" she pressed, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. The question landed like a stone in still water. Passengers murmured, phones rose higher, and Ethan, clutching his mother's sleeve, whispered, "Mom, why's he in trouble?" Sarah's chest tightened. She didn't have an answer, but she knew Ethan was watching, learning from her choice to speak. Michael's grip on control slipped. He reached for his radio, his voice rising. "You're refusing to cooperate. Turn around now." James remained seated, hands resting on his closed notebook. "Don't do this," he said softly, not a plea but a warning, rooted in the knowledge of what unchecked power could do. His calm, forged in Birmingham streets and military briefing rooms, held firm. He knew this moment wasn't about him alone, it was about a system that had looked at him and seen a threat, not a man. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through Gate 13, sharp and cold under the airport's white lights. James Carter stood slowly, his wrists bound behind him, his posture unbowed. The 62-year-old's eyes didn't waver, fixed on the space ahead, not on Officer Michael Reynolds, who stood breathing heavily, his hand still gripping James's arm. The act had taken seconds, but the weight of it stretched time, silencing the boarding announcements and rolling suitcases. Passengers froze, a mother pulled her child close, and the young man in the hoodie zoomed his camera in, capturing every detail. Michael's face was taut, his confidence fraying. He'd expected James to resist, to give him a reason to escalate, but James's stillness, his refusal to react with anger, unsettled him more than any protest. Michael's past stops, often Black or Latino passengers, had rarely drawn attention. A 2015 complaint, buried by his superiors, noted his above-average targeting of people of color, but he dismissed it as part of the job. Now, with eyes and cameras on him, that dismissal felt like a crumbling shield. Sarah Thompson stood firm, her heart pounding as she faced Michael. Ethan's small hand gripped hers, his question, "Mom, why's he in trouble?" still unanswered. Sarah's Seattle upbringing had taught her to believe in fairness, but standing here, challenging authority, was new. She felt the weight of her son's gaze, knowing this moment would shape how he saw justice. "You haven't answered me," she said, her voice steady. "Why him?" Before Michael could respond, a shout broke through. "Do anything." A middle-aged man, his voice raw with fury, stood from his seat, phone in hand. The crowd stirred, more cameras rising, the air crackling with tension. Michael's shoulder twitched, his control slipping further as he realized this wasn't just a routine check anymore. James's voice cut through, clear and measured. "I request the immediate presence of the airport's commanding officer." Not a plea, but a command, spoken with the authority of someone who'd led missions and briefed generals. His military past, where he'd faced prejudice yet risen to colonel, gave him the clarity to know when to speak and when to let silence work. A door swung open from the operations wing. A man in a dark shirt, gold badge gleaming, strode toward Gate 13, followed by two coordinators clutching digital folders. The commanding officer's eyes swept the scene, locking on James's wrist, where a sleek, black watch caught the light. A faint blue glow pulsed briefly, and the officer froze, recognizing a signal reserved for high-clearance personnel. At the security desk, a scanner beeped, and the coordinator's phone lit up with a classified alert: Echo Clearance, National Defense Command. The balance shifted in an instant. Michael's hand loosened on the cuffs, his face paling as he stepped back. James didn't move, his silence louder than the chaos around him. He'd known this moment would come, not from his words, but from the system's own mechanisms exposing its error. The crowd watched, breathless, as the commanding officer muttered, "Why didn't anyone tell me he was here?" "Because I don't need to be announced," James said, his voice calm but heavy, a reminder that his presence alone should have been enough. The cuffs slipped off James Carter's wrists, the metallic rasp echoing in the now silent Gate 13. The commanding officer, his badge glinting under the airport's stark lights, scanned a printed verification from the security system. His brow tightened as he read the third line, confirming James's identity as a senior consultant for the Department of Homeland Security, with Echo-level clearance. "Christ," he muttered, not to the crowd but to himself, bracing for the fallout. Why wasn't this flagged? James stood still, his dark eyes unwavering, the red marks on his wrists a quiet testament to the moment's weight. His Birmingham roots had taught him to endure, bricks thrown at his childhood home, colored signs at water fountains, but this wasn't the 1960s. This was 2025, and the sting of being reduced to a suspect still burned, though he buried it beneath his military-honed composure. He adjusted his sleeve, the black watch now dim, its signal having done its job. Officer Michael Reynolds stood to the side, his face drained of color. The Ohio native had always trusted his instinct, a reflex shaped by a homogeneous upbringing and years of unchecked stops. A 2015 report, buried by his superiors, had flagged his pattern of targeting Black and Latino passengers, but he dismissed it as routine. Now, with the commanding officer's eyes on him and phone still recording, that routine felt like a trap he'd walked into willingly. Sarah Thompson clutched Ethan's hand, her heart still racing from her challenge to Michael. She'd never spoken up like this before, but Ethan's wide-eyed question, "Why's he in trouble?" had pushed her past her fear. She glanced at her son, his small face searching hers for answers. She wanted him to see that silence wasn't always safe, that fairness wasn't just a word but a choice. The commanding officer turned to Michael, his voice low but sharp. "Explain this. Now." "It was a misidentification," Michael stammered, wiping sweat from his brow. "He wasn't cooperating. We thought he might be a threat." The words sounded hollow, even to him, as the crowd's silence grew colder. James's question, "Are you screening passengers, or screening skin color?" still hung in the air, unanswered. From the security desk, a young staffer in a gray-blue uniform stood abruptly, his badge askew. "It's him," he said, voice trembling with recognition. "James Carter, Senior Consultant, Homeland Security." The words cut through the terminal, phones rising higher, passengers whispering. The revelation wasn't just about James's rank, it was about the system that had failed to see him as anything but a suspect. James didn't confirm or deny. He looked toward the departure board, as if the moment had already served its purpose. His silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy, forcing the system to confront its own flaws. The commanding officer closed his folder, signaling for a private meeting. As footsteps faded, James remained, his presence a quiet challenge to a system that had mistaken his dignity for a threat. In a dim room behind Salt River Airport's operations wing, Officer Michael Reynolds sat under flickering fluorescent lights, his hands trembling as he wrote his report. The pen slipped, ink smudging, as if mirroring the unease he couldn't shake. Across from him, a senior officer from internal coordination, tasked with ethics reviews, skimmed his notes. "We're not asking for a defense," the officer said, eyes fixed on the page. "We're asking what made you think that action was justified." Michael's throat tightened. He'd grown up in a small Ohio town, where different meant suspicious, a mindset he carried into his 20-year career. A 2015 complaint, buried by his superiors, had noted his instinctive targeting of Black and Latino passengers, 90% of his stops, despite no evidence of threats. He'd shrugged it off, believing it was just the job. Now, facing James Carter's echo-level clearance, that belief crumbled. The secretary, a young woman with short hair and a step tracker, recorded every word, her pen moving steadily. Michael avoided her gaze. Months ago, he'd mocked her in a team meeting for mispronouncing a report title, laughing loud enough for all to hear. She hadn't flinched then, and now her calm focus felt like a quiet judgment. She wasn't the one trembling. Outside, the incident at Gate 13 had leaked to the press. A 2015 file resurfaced, detailing Michael's pattern of bias, alongside a newer petition from 2020 by Lisa Nguyen, a former officer. Lisa, a Vietnamese American, had reported Michael's targeting of passengers of color, including a Middle Eastern woman detained for looking around too often. Ignored, Lisa faced workplace isolation and resigned, now working as a community organizer. Her petition, shared online, went viral, with one line striking deep: "I walked away because I'd be next if I didn't go along." James Carter, meanwhile, sat in a quiet airport lounge, his notebook open but untouched. His Birmingham childhood, hiding from rioters, proving himself in a segregated world, had taught him that change came not from anger but from forcing systems to see themselves. He'd sent a single email to the airport: "I do not request punishment. I request acknowledgement." That sentence, now pinned to a staffer's desk, rippled through the system, demanding accountability without a word of rage. The media seized the story, with headlines citing Bureau of Justice data: people of color were 3 times more likely to face arbitrary airport screenings. Lisa's voice, alongside Malik Carter's, a high school teacher stopped by Michael years ago, amplified the call for reform. James's silence, paired with their words, became a mirror, reflecting a system that had protected bias for too long. The fallout from Gate 13 spread like wildfire, fueled by a single email from James Carter: "I do not request punishment. I request acknowledgement." The words, devoid of anger, landed with a weight that shook Salt River Airport's operations wing. Staffers whispered about it in break rooms, pinning the sentence to bulletin boards as a quiet call to action. James, 62, had returned to his routine, consulting for Homeland Security, his Birmingham-honed resilience keeping him steady. He'd seen systems bend before, under civil rights marches, under military reforms, and new change required patience, not noise. Lisa Nguyen, now 30 and a community organizer, sat in a Chicago cafe, sharing her story with a journalist. Her 2020 petition against Michael Reynolds had been ignored, pushing her out of airport security. "I wasn't fired," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I left because I refused to pick suspects based on skin." Her words, shared online, sparked thousands of retweets, resonating with those who'd felt silenced by systems that rewarded compliance. Lisa's isolation had turned to purpose, her past driving her to advocate for those unfairly targeted. Sarah Thompson, back in Seattle, couldn't shake the image of James in cuffs. At 38, she'd never confronted authority before, but Ethan's question, "Why is he in trouble?" had changed her. Over dinner, she told Ethan, "Sometimes, people judge others for how they look, not what they do. We have to speak up, even when it's scary." Ethan nodded, his 10-year-old mind grappling with fairness, his trust in his mother's courage growing. The media amplified the story, with a Stanford student study shaking the nation. Analyzing 8 years of airport complaint data, the students found 68% of temporary detentions involved people of color, with black passengers detained 53% of the time despite being 13% of the population. The numbers, stark and undeniable, forced a congressional hearing. A Massachusetts senator, her voice steady, said, "If thousands are detained without cause, sharing one race, this is systemic injustice." The hearing called for reviews of airport protocols, demanding transparency in screening practices. Michael Reynolds, suspended indefinitely, sat in his Ohio apartment, the TV replaying Gate 13 footage. His 2015 complaint and Lisa's petition haunted him, exposing a pattern he dismissed as just the job. He felt betrayed by a system that had enabled him, now leaving him to face the consequences alone. His silence wasn't defiance but a dawning realization that his instincts had been shaped by bias, not skill. At Salt River, a small plaque appeared near Gate 13, "Every act of disrespect leaves a mark." It wasn't James's doing, but his silence had inspired it, a quiet reminder that systems must answer for their failures. The ripple effect grew, not from protests but from people like Lisa, Sarah, and even Ethan, who began to see justice as a choice they could make. In a small training room at Salt River Airport, a dozen security officers sat under white lights, facing a glass board with a single question: if you see something wrong but no harm has happened yet, what do you do? The instructor, a veteran named Karen Brooks, 42, had been at Gate 13 that day, standing just steps away as James Carter was handcuffed. She hadn't spoken up, believing protocol trumped instinct. Now, in her new role with the Internal Reform Unit, she used that silence as a lesson. "I didn't act," she told the trainees, her voice steady but heavy. "I thought I didn't have the right. I was wrong." Karen's past mirrored many in the room, decades in security, trained to follow orders, not question them. But James's calm refusal to bow had shaken her. She'd requested a transfer to reform training, not to escape but to teach others to pause before acting. Showing the Gate 13 footage, muted, she asked, "Who feels short of breath watching this?" Hands rose, eyes dropped, and Karen shared her story, not as a hero, but as someone who'd learned silence was a choice she'd never make again. James, meanwhile, passed through Gate 13 monthly, unnoticed, his black watch now just a timepiece. His Birmingham childhood, hiding from violence, proving himself in a segregated world, had taught him that change came from exposing truth, not demanding vengeance. His email, "I do not request punishment. I request acknowledgement," had sparked a federal review. The Department of Transportation mandated transparent screening metrics, banning vague justifications like gut feeling. Salt River reported no baseless detentions for the first time in years. Michael Reynolds, in his Ohio apartment, faced an internal review. A leaked 2020 petition by Lee Sung-Gwin detailed his targeting of passengers of color, ignored by superiors. Now, with media spotlighting his 2015 complaint, Michael grappled with his role in a system that had enabled his bias. He wrote no defense, his silence a mix of shame and confusion, realizing he wasn't the villain but a product of a flawed machine. Sarah Thompson, teaching Ethan about fairness, joined a Seattle advocacy group, inspired by James's dignity. Ethan, now asking harder questions, wrote a school essay about Gate 13, titled, "Why Silence Hurts." Lisa Nguyen's community work gained traction, her story fueling reform efforts. The system's reckoning wasn't loud, no protests, no lawsuits, but it was real, driven by those who'd once stayed silent now choosing to act. A silver plaque gleamed near Gate 13's exit, its words etched quietly, "Justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be on time." Installed by the Internal Reform Group, it bore no names, no dates, just a reminder of what James Carter's silence had sparked. Travelers passed it daily, some pausing, others unaware, but the air felt different, less hurried, more deliberate. Security officers now met passengers' eyes, explaining procedures with care, their glances no longer detached but mindful. Karen Brooks led another training session, her voice softer but firmer than before. "Watch the Gate 13 footage again," she told the trainees, "but focus on the bystanders. What did they feel? A young officer, new to the job, raised her hand. I'd have been scared to speak up, but I'd feel worse staying quiet. Karen nodded, her own regret from that day fueling her mission to teach empathy over reflex. Her past silence, once a shield, was now a lesson. Inaction had a cost. Sarah Thompson, back in Seattle, sat with Ethan at a community meeting. Inspired by Gate 13, she joined a group advocating for fair policing. Ethan, 10, listened as adults shared stories of profiling, his small voice piping up, "If it's wrong, why don't people just say so?" Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride and resolve. Her Seattle upbringing hadn't prepared her for confrontation, but James's dignity and Ethan's questions had changed her. She was no activist, but she was learning to speak. Lisa Nguyen's story reached Chicago's airwaves, her calm recounting of leaving airport security striking a chord. "I refuse to pick suspects by skin," she said, her Vietnamese-American roots giving her words weight. Her community organizing now included the Gate 13 Fund, supporting those humiliated by profiling. Each email she received, travelers, students, residents, felt like a step toward healing her own past isolation. James Carter, passing through Gate 13, noticed the plaque but didn't stop. His Birmingham scars, memories of segregation, of proving himself in the Air Force, made him value action over symbols. He declined legal representation, telling a friend, "If every insult becomes a lawsuit, who has time to fix the system?" His silence wasn't retreat but a challenge, forcing the system to confront itself. As he walked on, a young officer hesitated before checking a passenger's ID, glancing at the plaque, choosing precision over instinct. The new awareness wasn't in headlines but in small shifts: officers' clearer reports, Sarah's advocacy, Ethan's questions, Lisa's fund. James's silence had lit a spark, and the system, once blind to its flaws, was beginning to see. A child's letter arrived at Salt River Airport security office, scrawled in uneven handwriting with dinosaur stamps. "If that was my dad, I would scream loud, but why didn't anyone scream?" Signed only, Maxwell, Class 4B, it brought tears to Clara, the office worker who opened it. The question, innocent yet piercing, echoed through staff meetings, pinned to the breakroom board beside Karen Brooks's transfer request. Karen, now 42, had written, "I stayed quiet because I feared getting the procedure wrong. Now I'm more afraid of staying that way forever." Karen's reform unit grew, training officers to listen before acting, to see people, not profiles. In one session, she showed the Gate 13 footage, asking, "Who felt helpless watching this?" A trainee admitted, "I'd have waited for proof, but now I see waiting can be wrong too." Karen's own silence that day, rooted in years of following protocol, had taught her that empathy wasn't in manuals, it was in choosing to act. Her work reshaped how officers saw their role, not as enforcers but as guardians of fairness. Sarah Thompson and Ethan attended a Seattle rally, where Ethan's essay, "Why Silence Hurts," was read aloud. At 10, he spoke of James's handcuffing, asking why fairness wasn't automatic. Sarah, once hesitant, now led workshops, sharing how one moment at Gate 13 changed her. Her Seattle liberalism had been theoretical, now, it was personal, driven by Ethan's belief that speaking up mattered. Their story inspired others to question silence, to act before harm was done. Lisa Nguyen's Gate 13 Fund grew, offering legal and emotional support to profiling victims. A college student, stopped for looking unfamiliar, wrote to Lisa, "You made me feel seen." Lisa, her Vietnamese-American identity once a source of workplace tension, now channeled her past into advocacy. Her 2020 petition against Michael Reynolds, once ignored, was now cited in training manuals, a reminder that speaking out, even at a cost, could spark change. James Carter, still a consultant, walked through Gate 13, unnoticed by most. His Birmingham past, facing violence, climbing military ranks, had taught him that systems change when forced to see themselves. He didn't seek recognition, his silence had done enough. The plaque, "Justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be on time," stood as his legacy, not because he demanded it but because others carried it forward. The legacy took root, not in fanfare but in the quiet resolve of those who'd learned to see differently. Under the soft glow of Salt River Airport's lights, James Carter walked through Gate 13, his son, Marcus, 8, at his side. The 62-year-old's steps were steady, his black watch catching the light as Marcus's small backpack bounced with each step. James's Birmingham roots, dodging bricks, proving himself in a segregated Air Force, had taught him to carry dignity quietly. He didn't speak of Gate 13, but Marcus, curious and bright, noticed the plaque, "Justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be on time." "Did something happen here, Dad?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide. James paused, adjusting Marcus's strap, his voice gentle. "Someone was treated unfairly once, and no one spoke up." He didn't say it was him. He didn't need to. His silence that day, refusing to rage or submit, had forced a system to speak. The plaque, the revised procedures, no detentions without clear reasons, were proof that change, though slow, was real. "Does that still happen?" Marcus pressed, gripping his father's hand. James looked at the plaque, then at his son. "Less now, because more people learned not to look away." His answer, honest but hopeful, carried the weight of his past and the promise of Marcus's future. They walked on, the airport's hum unchanged, but Gate 13 felt different, a marker of a moment when one man's silence made a system listen. Karen Brooks, now leading reform training, shared James's story with new officers, not as a hero's tale but as a question: what would you do? Sarah Thompson and Ethan advocated in Seattle, their voices growing stronger. Lisa Nguyen's Gate 13 fund supported dozens, her past pain fueling her purpose. Michael Reynolds, no longer an officer, lived quietly, his silence a reckoning with his role in a flawed system. The story lived on, not in headlines but in small acts: an officer hesitating before a stop, a child asking why, a plaque polished daily. James's legacy wasn't his name but the quiet echo of change, carried by those who chose to see. To everyone who followed James's journey, thank you. You've walked through a story of injustice, courage, and quiet change. If this tale moved you, hit subscribe on Revenge Ties, share it, and drop a comment. Join us where every story sparks a new beginning, challenging us to see, act, and stand for what's right. Keep carrying your truth, and I'll meet you at the next gate.